Everyone. Welcome to today's National Emerging Issues webinar on electric vehicle infrastructure. I'm Delane Bender, the Interim Executive Director for the National Association of State Chief Administrators, and I'm joined today by a distinguished panel and NASCA's Research Manager, Kathleen Kelly. Before we start, a few reminders. Today's webinar is being recorded and will be available in the NASCA Knowledge Center. Please take a moment to rename yourself and include your state and company name. If you'd like to, you may also drop your name and location in the chat function. During today's webinar, we invite you to submit questions, and you can also use the chat feature for that. So now I'll turn it over to Kathleen for today's poll questions.
Thank you, Delane. Welcome, everyone. Just to get us started, we have a few poll questions. Tammy will pull it up and you'll be able to answer right through the Zoom. So Tammy, if you can pull up our first poll question. So how important is electrifying your state's fleet for the state's overall decarbonization goals? Not at all, neutral, somewhat, or very. All right, so we've got people answering. So looking at mostly very. We'll give people a couple more minutes to fill this out. All right. So we've got 55% with very important, followed by 26% at neutral, 0% at not at all. So this is definitely a very important topic to all. All right. Thanks for answering this first one. Tammy, if you can pop up the second one, please. All right. How prepared is your state to transition the state's fleet to zero-emission vehicles? Please click one of the following. Honestly, I'm not sure. We haven't started yet. We are still developing a plan. We have a plan in place and are ready to begin the process, and we have already begun the process. And give everyone just a moment here to fill this out. All right, so it's fairly mixed. Most 34% with we're still developing a plan, followed by 31% we have already begun the process, and then not sure. And we have a plan in place, but we're ready to begin the process, and we haven't started yet. So it's kind of all over the board, but this is good information. So again, appreciate this, everyone. All right. Thank you for filling out these polls.
Thanks, everybody. We appreciate your insights. I think this will be valuable conversation for everybody on the call. NASCA TV is an ongoing opportunity to meet with thought leaders who are members of NASCA and engage with state leaders and corporate partners to address emerging issues affecting state governments. We're excited to dig into today's conversations. So first, I'd like to introduce our panelists. Rebecca Hawerda, Commissioner from the Department of Administration in the state of Indiana. David St. Jean, Director of the Office of Energy and Sustainability from the Department of General Services, State of Maryland. Shannon Peliquin, Partner at McKinsey & Company, and Josephine Tucker, Managing Director, Clean Energy and Infrastructure Advisory at JLL. Thank you all for being here. Electric vehicles, EVs, are becoming increasingly popular in the United States for personal, commercial, and government use. Most state governments have set targets for getting more electric vehicles on the road. Before these targets can be met, there are several major hurdles that need to be cleared. For states, one of the hurdles is the transition of public transportation and state fleets from diesel to zero-emission vehicles. A zero-emission fleet would go a long way in helping states achieve their zero-emission goals, but the transition has many pieces for states to consider and work into place. A few of those pieces include developing the infrastructure and a large enough workforce with the appropriate skills and training to support the transition. Most states are in the beginning stages of developing creative solutions to build up this needed workforce, create the essential infrastructure, and electrify state fleets. Today, we'll discuss the transition to a zero-emission state fleet and the factors inherent in that transition. Our panelists will present their responses to those considerations of fleet electrification, charging infrastructure, growing and preparing the workforce, and being competitive through the state, federal, and private funds available. So I'd like to ask our panelists to please introduce themselves and give an overview of their areas of responsibility in their respective state or company. And we'll start with David.
Thank you, Delane, and thanks to NASCA for offering us this opportunity to talk a bit about what we're up to. So I'm the director of the Office of Energy and Sustainability, Department of General Services for the state of Maryland. And our office is responsible for a lot of different things, but for the purposes of this call, we are responsible for installing all of the electric vehicle infrastructure as the state transitions its fleet out of ICE vehicles to EVs. So, yep, thanks. It's great to be here.
Thank you, David. And now Rebecca from Indiana.
Good afternoon. My name is Dr. Rebecca Holwerda. I have the privilege of serving as the Commissioner of the Indiana Department of Administration. The agency is responsible for managing various statewide functions, including procurement, public works, capital projects, state surplus, and one of those things being fleet services. With the influx of federal money, EVs have become such a hot topic. And as the state is in the very beginning stages of how we need to spend the funding, I'm really excited about being part of this webinar and look forward to the conversation today of kind of sharing what Indiana's journey has been. Thanks so much, Delane and NASCA, for facilitating this conversation.
Thank you. And now Shannon Peliquin from McKinsey.
Good afternoon, and thank you to NASCA for offering this opportunity. I'm Shannon Peliquin. I'm a partner in McKinsey's San Francisco office, and I lead our work in public transportation infrastructure with a focus in North America. So I have had the privilege of talking about this from a state Department of Transportation, state administrative office perspective, as well as from urban transit agencies, ports and airports, and everyone in between, as well as serving the private sector. And one of our goals is to make sure that the best of the private sector can be brought to the public sector, especially when it comes to stretching public dollars as effectively and efficiently as possible and maximizing the impact of the investments that are being made, both on the fleet side of the house as well as the infrastructure side of the house. So look forward to the conversation and discussion, and then just continued admiration and inspiration for the work that you all are undertaking on behalf of your states.
Thank you. And Josephine Tucker from JLL.
Good afternoon, everyone, and thanks very much to NASCA for having me and for all of those who have joined us virtually for this riveting discussion. Josephine Tucker, I lead the Clean Energy and Infrastructure Advisory business at JLL and have been working very closely with our public sector partners across the federal, state, and local space as they navigate the new wonderful world of EV charging. I'm really excited to get into this topic. I think it's a very nascent market. We've all got a lot of questions, but the good news is that we're figuring it out together. So thanks again to NASCA for having me, and look forward to the conversation.
Fantastic. All right, now we'll get started. And our first question is for David. Maryland's Department of General Services coordinates the statewide strategy for EV infrastructure at state facilities. How is Maryland working on electrifying the state fleet? And also, can you tell us more about EV charging infrastructure at state facilities and provide recommendations for dealing with any challenges that arise?
Yes, thanks. We actually have been doing this for a couple of years now. We started actually before legislation was put into place last year that requires our entire fleet, the state fleet of approximately 4,000 passenger vehicles, to be zero emission vehicles by 2031, and then all light duty trucks by 2036. Over the past couple of years, the state's purchased 133 electric vehicles as our internal combustion engine fleet retires. Just an agency is required to replace their ICE vehicle with an EV. And my office is responsible for providing the EV charging station across all state agencies, so across the entire state. Fortunately, it's a pretty small, geographically small state. It makes it a little bit easier. Over the past couple of years, we've had $1 million budget each year. We had 2 positions funded in FY22 to help us with the program. We hired an electrical engineer and a program manager to help us get started. It was, it's absolutely a new program. We didn't really have anyone to look to for advice because not many states have, taken this on yet. So it's the value of this call, I think. Last year, we managed 26 charging projects that we ended up getting 146 charging ports out of them. We have a bunch of projects sort of halfway completed now. So by the end of this fiscal year in June, we should have about 200 charging ports up and running. And we plan to install, currently, we're thinking 2,000 ports by 2031, which provides a port for every other fleet vehicle, which frankly is going to present its own challenges of overnight charging if you only have one port for every 2 vehicles. But we're, a lot of this is still evolving as we work on it. And we've also partnered with the electric utilities who are running a pilot program right now. They were given the green light by the state Public Service Commission to run this pilot to install EV charging stations, both level 2 and level 1. We're only installing level 2 for the ones the state owns, but the utilities are also installing fast chargers. And, there's been a lot of coordination with the utilities as far as getting them the right agreements, contract documents, and all that in place that would allow them to install what's essentially private property on state property. But we have been kind of relying on them as we ramp up our own program. And so that's basically, where we are as far as, up to date electrifying this fleet. And I will tell you that some of the challenges we've faced over the past couple of years, sort of a bullet chain list, we've had supply chain issues, of course, which we have with everything from lighting to, to electric vehicles, charging stations, everything. In fact, currently, as of a month or so ago, dealerships are no longer wanting to get involved in fleet vehicle contracts because they can sell all these cars at top dollar to the customer, right? Because we're all waiting to get an electric vehicle. And that's kind of an issue for us. We may actually not be able to get another electric vehicle for 2 years, which for us gives us a nice window to install the infrastructure, but we are probably going to be a little slow at actually purchasing the vehicles. One thing that surprised us is the maintenance and repairs of the charging equipment. And currently we've only installed networked charging equipment, and I'll talk a little bit more about that later. But the maintenance and repairs has been a bit of a challenge. Also drivers. You wouldn't think that electric vehicle would be too complicated for anyone, but apparently it is. We get everything from, we have these little cards that you use to plug into the charger, especially in utility charging, that allows a person to get their car charged up there. And we get people, punching holes in them to put them on their keychains and that kind of thing. And to explain to people you can't do that. So lots of odds and ends. So that in a way, we've sort of become a help desk for a lot of drivers as far as transitioning them to EVs. And that actually kind of surprised me. I didn't think they were that complicated, but apparently they are. We also facilitate an EV ambassador program, which is just sort of an ad hoc group that we put together in the office of current EV drivers and those who want to be EV drivers. And, we meet occasionally and, swap stories and try to help others figure out how to make this transition. Yeah, so that's about where we are and some of the challenges we faced up until now. I guess back to you, Delane.
Thank you, David. I appreciate that.
Mm-hmm.
Our next question is for Commissioner Howolda. So Governor Holcomb, along with the governors from Illinois, Michigan, Minnesota, and Wisconsin, collaborated on the Regional Electric Vehicle for the Midwest Compact. Please tell us more about the REV for Midwest and its importance for the state of Indiana.
Happily. So the Regional Electric Vehicle Coalition, and I'll just call REV Midwest, was established really through a non-binding MOU that was entered into by the 5 states, Illinois, Michigan, Minnesota, and Wisconsin. It really grew out of a collaborative group, primarily comprised of administrators of the Volkswagen Environmental Mitigation Trust for the various states, where the VW administrators just really began working together, pitching ideas, and they had their first in-person meeting in Detroit in 2019. Kept meeting all through COVID, and finally in September of 2021, the MOU was signed. So each state is heavily involved in the deployment of electric vehicle charging infrastructure to accommodate the growth of EVs statewide. And while each state is looking inward to facilitate their own statewide network, really Rev Midwest serves as a collaborative endeavor to ensure that we have our own in-state networks, but also create a Midwest network for EVs, because we realize the importance of having regional planning. And so we're working together for efficient fleet electrification along key commercial corridors to safeguard economic security, reduce emissions, improve health, advance innovation in the field. And really the states that are participating are positioning themselves the best possible way where we can leverage and collectively increase public and private investment in EV and EV infrastructure. So some of the key priorities that we've outlined to help us accomplish some of this is we're going to collaborate with our partner states to develop consistent and efficient corridors, really considering the differences between EV charging stations, what the minimum specifications will be and best practices for implementation. Coordinating with the regional EV infrastructure for site optimization, deployment strategies, and really focusing our target routes on commercial significance for medium and heavy duty electrification, and then cooperating with our energy providers to be able to reduce emissions from all vehicle sectors through the electrification, expanding of renewable energy and efficiency. So Indiana is the crossroads of America, so it's imperative that we do our best, and what Governor Holcomb likes to say, we're the smart crossroads of America. So kind of as the nation moves in the direction of electrification of light, medium, and heavy duty vehicles, want to make sure there's not a silo approach to the infrastructure development. So we have to work together so that Midwest travelers have a way to be able to go throughout the area. So it's important that we talk to our neighbors, understand what their activities have been. And so as we look to deploy stations near and around the bordering states, we want to make sure that we're strategic and use our dollars so that they're reasonably spaced out across our borders. They don't want to put too high dollar charging stations just a couple miles from each other just because it's a border crossing. And so Red Midwest recently applied for a U.S. Department of Energy grant to put together a mapping tool to kind of help us with best practices and know where we should place the infrastructure. Now, we haven't heard if we'll be receiving that, but we really think it will be a huge asset to help us in mapping out what the future of our EV infrastructure is. Ongoing coordination via Rev Midwest really will help Indiana ensure our infrastructure investments are maximized while minimizing duplication efforts and the oversaturation of resources with all the states around us. So we're very excited about what this collaboration has brought.
Thank you so much. And I just want to remind everybody on the call that if you have a question or experience that you want to share, please do drop it into the chat. I see some coming up, and as time permits, we'll try to respond to those at the end of the call. So now we're moving to our next question. Shannon, transitioning to electric vehicles and developing the infrastructure to support the movement to electric vehicles can be expensive. One way to reduce costs and optimize resources is a regional approach to infrastructure, like the REV for Midwest that Commissioner Halberta just shared with us. Are there ways that states can work with the private sector to garner the best outcomes in the adoption and accessibility of EVs and EV charging infrastructure?
It's a great, complicated question. I was reflecting; these are big questions, so I will do my best. But there's three areas where the private sector and the public sector can likely learn from each other, work effectively together, and hopefully co-invest as appropriate. Those are infrastructure, the fleet itself, as we think about fleet transitions, and then also workforce and workforce development as we think about what it's going to take to operate, maintain, fix, repair, et cetera, in the transition, and especially for small and medium businesses in moving to support EVs and EVCI. On the infrastructure build out itself, Where we've been most excited about the opportunity to, again, kind of stretch public dollars as far as possible, as well as deliver on urban versus rural balance, on equity implications, and the investments that are going on in regional or municipalities, as well as at the state level. One of the things that we have spent a significant amount of time helping folks think through is, how do we know if it's a good, profitable site or not? And so that level, and what does that imply around the type of entity that might be willing to work with us, and how should that inform our procurement strategy or procurement mix? And so one of the pieces to be really thoughtful around is trying to get almost like a private sector or private equity investment lens to the types of sites that you are considering around the segments that might be attractive, both through some of the federal funding that's available, but likely also the things that were underway with this state programs, and in some cases the energy players and municipalities as well. That level of site specificity or site granularity allows you to do things like understand what utilization might have to be like, depending on the structure of your energy market, will also hopefully inform where and how choice points exist around the cost of energy or the cost of power or new age fuel, what that implies in terms of potential profit pools, and then how attractive or not attractive a particular segment or site could be relative to other options that exist. Having that level of specificity around, is this site going to be profitable or not? What would you have to believe for that to be true in terms of adoption, utilization, and price points, and who gets to make those decisions? Actually, really, it ends up being helpful to inform the procurement strategy you might go out and think through. So, many of the states that we've been having conversations with right now, it's a question mark around, is it an all for one? Is it a site by site perspective? And we'll see what the market tells us. Is there some mix and matching that we can do, and I've seen be successful in other global arenas around being very thoughtful around the profitable and perhaps less profitable sites to make sure you're load balancing, for lack of a better phrase, where you might get high demand for a site build out versus lower demand. And then finally, how can you make it as easy as possible to actually procure this? So thinking about contracting archetypes, learning from entities that might have been doing this previously, to make this as plug and play as possible, no pun intended, when it comes down to that learning curve. As infrastructure gets built out, more information is available, etc. So that's one side on the infrastructure approach to really understanding site level profitability specifics to inform procurement, and then to think through different types or archetypes of procurement that can be used over the years to incent private sector involvement. The second bit to where the private sector and the public sector can collaborate is around fleet optimization. And so one of the questions that we get a lot is, well, how does this actually impact my operations? And what does this mean in terms of my maintenance plans? And how do I think about the long tail of, do I need to put in my orders right now in order to get access to something 3 years down the road? And there, the guidance around public and private sector would be to learn from some of the large fleet players in your state who are likely making these, likely experiencing some of the total cost of ownership questions right now, as well as thinking about the type of technology that can come down the pike, especially for heavy duty vehicles or for those specialized use cases. Oftentimes in the private sector, we've been helping our clients think through a wait and see approach around where and how some zero emissions based vehicles might come to fruition in a different way. So that's one where, again, from a fleet perspective, taking a total cost of ownership approach, thinking about the timeline that's right for your fleet and your use cases versus kind of reacting to what the market tells you is available is important. And then also being really thoughtful around, where and how electrification might be the right answer and where it might not be the right answer based on what the reliability, the affordability, and the type of dependability that you need in terms of a variety of different use cases. The final thing I'll just say in terms of public-private partnership is around workforce and workforce development. And so really thinking about introducing and working in collaboration with the Department of Commerce or the Department of Economic Development or the Department of Labor, depending on your state. How do you think through where and how you can augment the successfulness of participation in some of these opportunities for small and medium-sized businesses, especially on the charging infrastructure side of the house? And then as you think about workforce training, workforce development, what does it mean to be a mechanic for EVs? You actually end up being a bit more of a software engineer than you do a traditional mechanic. What does that imply in terms of some of the vocational training and schooling that you need? What does that imply in terms of the type of maintenance and maintenance and repair expertise that you need in a state to make sure that you are not only installing but are able to maintain and continue to operate at pace and at scale the infrastructure network as it gets built out? So these are some of the considerations where, again, how do we reevaluate apprenticeship, certifications, training opportunities to make sure that we have a workforce, especially one that does a great job of reflecting local talent and local need?
Thank you very much, Shannon. Appreciate that answer. So our next question is for Josephine. There is a lot of state and federal funding for EVs and EV infrastructure, including the National Electric Vehicle Infrastructure Formula Program, or NEVI, to which most states submitted plans this past summer. What are some ways that states can leverage and best manage the NEVI formula program and other federal program funds?
Thanks, Kathleen. And, there's been so many good comments so far, just in terms of how to maximize funding, how to maximize opportunity, and how to collaborate. So first, I'm going to talk a little bit about NEVI, because I think it's important to kind of differentiate that funding program from some of the other avenues that are available. But just to put a bit of a teaser out there, I will also summarize a bit of the comments from our other panelists, as well as, my perspective in terms of the answer to your question. And it's communication, collaboration, and contracting. So I'll come back to that in terms of the management part of your question. But for those who may not be aware, the NEVI program was out of the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act. It made $7.5 billion available for states to really execute on public-facing EV charging. The goals of the administration were really to try and plug the gaps and in terms of charging infrastructure across the state highway network, and to address that anxiety, they call it range anxiety, that EV drivers or maybe vehicle owners who don't have an EV but are considering getting an EV are worried that they may not be able to charge up. If I want to drive 200-300 miles, I want to be sure that there's going to be ample opportunity for me to charge up my battery and not be stranded somewhere. So, that program was really, really targeted at public-facing charging infrastructure, which is very different to the conversations we've been having around fleet. The NEVI program, made funds available, a formula fund, which was $5 billion of the $7.5, and then $2.5 are discretionary, to all states who submitted a plan, as you mentioned, Kathleen. So a lot of planning and essentially, site evaluation, to the point that Shannon was making before, has really been, the ask of states over the last couple of months. And, there were a lot of requirements put in place by the federal government to sort of stipulate where the charging infrastructure should go to be close to the highway, to make it, accessible to the public, to have a certain level of charge. These had to be fast chargers. So there's a lot of, bounds within which, states had to work in order to qualify for the NEVI funds. But really, like I said, the ambition was to get those funds out the door as quickly as possible to try to plug the gaps across the state highway network. And then over time, I think the vision is that there will be community-based approaches and private sector, approaches that will serve the market where those hotspots sort of emerge. But what we don't want to have happen is, if you're taking a road trip with your family and you go across, a particular state, you've got a bunch of chargers in the city, and then as soon as you get out to a stretch of the countryside, you're left without many options. So hopefully in the next, year or two, we start to see that build out really take place. I think one of the challenges that we're seeing in the work that we're doing with state DOTs, who are the main agency responsible for passing through those federal dollars, is that, EV charging is very much a real estate and a utilities challenge, right? If you think about where people go today to fill up, their gas in their vehicles, or stop and get, a coffee on a road trip or whatever, there are businesses along the state highway network that, already exist. And what wouldn't have made sense is for state DOTs to just build a totally new charging station on the side of the highway. No, what makes a lot more sense is to leverage all those businesses that already exist, which means putting, public facing charging infrastructure on private property. And so that definitely has been a complicating factor, thinking about where, why, and when, the public stops to either fill up their gas tank or get a coffee, has also been part of that utilization question, that Shannon mentioned before. What are going to be the driving factors to ensure that you've got the maximum number of cars stopping at this site versus another site? What are the amenity values, or how far do you have to drive once you exit, the freeway? These are a lot of the variables that state DOTs have had to think through when putting their plans together. So as a leader that's working in this space and serving our clients, kind of navigating all those difficult questions, I can say it's been an interesting journey trying to do that site location analysis and make sure that, we're picking and choosing the right places, but also not going where the private sector would already go, because the intention of the NEVI funds is not to compete with the private sector, but to provide, that subsidy to offer public facing infrastructure where the market may not be ready to go today, but maybe in 3-5 years time, there's going to be a lot of EVs there, and we want to be sure that they've got the infrastructure that they need. So that's all I'll say on NEVI. Kind of turning the other side of the coin, which I think the two major use cases are public facing infrastructure and workplace charging. I'll sort of group those together, and then fleet, which is a totally different beast. And when we think about, the folks who are on this call, decision makers in state government who are trying to put these plans together and think about what their own charging needs might be, I think it's fair to say there's probably a lot of folks who are maybe more on the fleet side of the coin. And, those business models are thankfully a little bit easier than public facing infrastructure, because you are more likely to see a densification of chargers in one place. A lot of vehicles tend to be parked overnight. Fleet vehicles tend to be parked in one, or several different locations, rather than, individual cars kind of have to stop off the highway, or having onesie, twosie chargers at office buildings. It's a very different equation. So, and thinking about how you get access to funding and also make yourself attractive to partnership with the private sector, there's a little bit easier of a use case there for fleet vehicles. I think, the things that states can do to really maximize their attractiveness and their competitiveness for funding, both from, the federal government, but also in terms of the private sector. I come back to the three things that I mentioned at the beginning. So communication, collaboration, and contracting. When it comes to communication, there has just been so much noise around EV charging and a lot of uncertainty, both, on behalf of the buyers who are thinking about whether they should get an EV, vehicle or not, but also on behalf of investors, right? And, from the JLL standpoint, we see a lot of that in terms of our clients who are trying to think through where they should be investing their dollars in EV businesses, in real estate that needs EV charging infrastructure. But also, a lot of the small companies that we work with who are turnkey providers trying to figure out where they should take their business. So communication is key. Even if you don't have a fully baked plan, I would urge you to communicate your needs, your questions out to the market. We've seen a lot of states issue, announcements or RFIs, and these things all act as signals to your partners, to the private sector, to let them know, what your procurement needs are going to be, and kind of gets them ready, even if you haven't got a fully baked plan yet. Some communication, I think, is absolutely essential. And it also helps with some of the supply chain challenges. David and others mentioned supply chain is a real issue. There is a semiconductor shortage. There's issues with, lithium batteries. There are things happening from, an industrial standpoint that really impact on the availability of the core materials, which go into EV chargers, which go into batteries, and a lot of the technology, supported technology that's required for utility upgrades to make EV charging possible. So when we think about making sure that you're at the front of the line, both in terms of the vehicles that you're ordering, but also on the charging infrastructure that's needed, some level of communication to make sure that you have a place in line is absolutely key. The second piece around collaboration, I was really, really enlightened to hear, the stories from Rebecca and from David. I love this concept of the EV charging or the EV ambassador program, just being able to spread knowledge and awareness and, to ask questions, to, leverage each other as a sounding board, I think is totally key. And Rebecca loved that concept of having more of a regionally based approach and taking into consideration that planning does not happen in a bubble, and that, a collection of states will be much better off, if they're working together, sharing resources and planning, and that may help with supply chain as well. From a state perspective, I think collaboration within state agencies and across is absolutely key. So, when we were talking about the NEVI program before, obviously that funding was primarily made available to state DOTs, and now we're starting to see a lot of dollars for fleet vehicles, for buses. And so there are other state agencies like those who are on the call today, as well as, school districts and municipalities, transit agencies, who are all putting together their own, fleet plans and trying to go to market for the necessary equipment. There's a lot of collaboration that can happen, within states, within those different state agencies, and also with other levels of government. And I think that can truly help to bring a streamlined approach to the EV charging infrastructure and make sure that, you're getting kind of maximizing buying power, frankly, for the state, but also, getting the most efficiencies that you can from this process, and not waiting 2 years or 3 years because, you're only ordering 100. And if you'd collaborated with 2 other agencies, maybe, you could order 500, and that might bring down the cost as well as the time. So I won't belabor the point anymore on collaboration, but absolutely key. And then the final one is contracting. So, there's a lot of opportunity right now, I think, to leverage things like pre-qualified vendor lists. There's things like Sourcewell, and, GSA just did a big, EV supplier bench contract. So there's a lot of efforts going on right now to try to consolidate, the EV vehicle and EV charging resources so that it makes procurement and contracting a lot easier for you. I would definitely urge folks on the call to find out what those resources are, try to use those lists and those pre-vetted vendors as much as possible, so that you can move as quickly as you need to, and also take some of the the load off of your teams as you try to navigate and understand the requirements and competencies of this very emerging space. So that's That's all I have, Kathleen. Hopefully that wasn't too long-winded of an answer. But I see there's lots of activity in the chat, so we can always come back to the discussion.
That was terrific. And we definitely chose the right panel. So I'd like to now invite all of our panelists to turn their cameras back on. We're going to ask one more group question, and then we'll get to the ones in the chat. So question, electrifying the state fleet and developing electric vehicle infrastructure requires a large enough and specifically qualified workforce. What solutions are there for ensuring that the workforce is present and ready to go? And let's start with Commissioner Hallworth.
So during the 2021 legislative session, Governor Holcomb signed House Bill 1168 into law, establishing an electric vehicle product commission. The EV Product Commission just released its first report in September of 2022, and actually will continue its work because it's brought immense value for thinking about, okay, what do we need in the future? So while Rev Midwest was more about collaboration on a Midwest scale to facilitate the deployment of EV and EV charging infrastructure, this product commission is taking inventory of what Indiana's workforce is and the economic development opportunities that are out there. So the commission is made up of policymakers, unions, industry, academia, and it's really taking a holistic look at what are our opportunities and challenges that lie ahead for Indiana to really be a leader in this space, and seeing what or who do we need to partner with, whether it's other EV manufacturing businesses, equipment manufacturers, or even coming alongside EV battery plants to say, okay, what is it in the future that we want to start doing as a state, and how do we have the workforce to do that? So whether evaluating opportunities and needs for training within electric vehicle production, or to determining if our current training centers promoting careers in traditional manufacturing and automotive industry needs to be converted to something more with the EV infrastructure and vehicle manufacturing. So there's a lot of questions that we're trying to figure out right now, and this commission has done a fantastic job of not only talking with industry leaders, but also with everyone else, stakeholders that are involved in this process to try and help figure it out. For a state side of things, we know that our current state mechanic shops will need to be retooled to accommodate for EV chargers and changes, and state employees will need to be retrained, or we need to bring new people on, which some of the panelists have touched on. So it will no doubt be an ongoing discussion of how the state can be best prepared. But really, thanks to the EV Product Commission, they're helping us think through all of these things and doing it in a really measured and thoughtful way.
David St. Jean, would you like to respond to that same question, please?
Yes, I can probably briefly. As Josephine mentioned, the fleet is sort of its own animal. It's in a lot of ways a lot simpler than opening this infrastructure to the general public. And essentially, I mean, my office is, since our sole responsibility is putting in the infrastructure for the fleet, the training has been sort of in-house. We hired an electrical engineer and a program manager. She had some experience with private EV ownership, and she worked for a utility company, I believe it was in Illinois, on their EV program. You know, the electrical engineer has been great. I was very interested in the topic, created a project manual for all of our projects, you know, for determining what sort of transformer, the conduit, the cable, the trenching, and all the rest of that. And, you know, we're general services. That's what we do. We install stuff. So, you know, it's the technology is not necessarily challenging for us, I guess. Some of the things I think we're finding to be more challenging is, you know, the repair. I don't know that they need a whole lot of maintenance, but definitely the repair has been an issue with our network charging stations, and primarily from the network side of it, not from the electrical side of it, but from the IT side of it. Yeah, but that's about it. It's been a relatively easy thing for us to train up staff to do what we need to do for the state.
Right, Josephine Tucker.
We need to hire more electricians. I think, at the end of the day, the infrastructure is actually fairly simple. These are not that complicated of assets compared to a lot of the portfolios that, folks on the call are used to dealing with. So that's good news. The bad news is we don't have enough electricians, So we definitely need to find ways to incentivize those, those trades and leverage, our contractor networks as best possible. And I mentioned a couple, resources for that from the GSA to Sourcewell. And I think that there's some nationally recognized training programs that are, being reviewed at the moment by DOT as part of the NEVI program. But I think, workforce is just going to be one of those things that we have to realize we're in an evolutionary period. The market is changing, and we all sort of have to adjust accordingly. So even us, as we think about, what does the infrastructure need to be? What does the IT need to be? We're all in the process of learning. So.
Thank you. And Shannon Pelican.
Hard to follow up on such good answers, but maybe a couple of things just building off this theme of transition and then the role of the state versus private sector. I think there continues to be a lot of room in the workforce arena for collaboration. So especially as you think about what it's going to take to actually develop the quote unquote market to make its an own industry, that growth trajectory and the collaboration that you need around the workforce in terms of bringing things online, repairing and maintaining, and then hopefully learning from too. So just like states are collaborating on fleet decarb goals and transition plans all the way through infrastructure build out, how and where can you be as flexible as possible with some of your workforce goals or expertise, right? So I think being thoughtful there with both the labor overall and then some of your close collaborators to say, how do we actually inspire and share the talent that is so critical to making this happen? That's one element. The other element, and we spent a lot of time talking about this too, is just, especially as you think about interoperability, this point, David, that you made earlier around, user experience, user awareness and education, thinking about what it takes to have really good technical design augmented by, the more classic software design. And so this UX piece actually becomes quite important as you think about making things work across state lines and moving where people move on top of their Apple wallets or whatever the case may be. And the third thing I would just say is continuing to help folks imagine that this is actually a function. So if you say electrician to a high school senior, they don't automatically think charging infrastructure, right? And so I think also helping people broaden out what's in the realm of the possible in terms of good, steady, really beneficial incomes that can support families. This ends up being an entire career path that people need to imagine themselves into, and we should be talking a lot about that.
Excellent. Kathleen, we now are ready for some of the questions in the chat, so I'll turn it over to you.
Yeah, thank you, Delane. We got a lot of great questions, so thank you all for those. I think we have time for one question for all of our panelists before we get into key takeaways. And again, if we don't answer your question, we'll certainly be reaching out on social media to answer your questions, because again, I appreciate all the audience. We got a lot of great questions. So for agencies that are building out fleet-specific chargers that won't have revenue capture, how are you building in those data maintenance costs into overall planning? Is it handled centrally, spread across agencies, or maybe just allowing for wider use for non-network chargers? So hopefully I stated that correctly, that question. But this is for any of our panelists, so feel free to jump in if you have a specific answer for that. So thank you.
I'll take a crack at it. It's something that certainly we've talked about. I'll say for individual infrastructure for charging stations, once they end up at an agency, it becomes their property, essentially. They're responsible for any maintenance contract, for any repair, et cetera. And I think this is one reason why we are starting, I think, to shy away from the networked charging stations, because it just they're very complicated, and the data that, and I'll talk about this in a minute as far as the takeaway, but the data that they're collecting, how much of that do we need when we have good telematics software in our automobiles that are collecting information on how much energy each car, how much electricity each car is using when it charges up, how often they're being used, et cetera. So we don't really plan on, and I've had this discussion several times with our fiscal department, is if we have enough charging stations for each fleet vehicle, for each agency, and occasionally an agency will travel to another agency and use their charging station for a few hours, the amount of electricity that they're going to be using is de minimis. And the effort that it would take to actually put into place a system where you could actually charge them back across agencies, transferring funds for using a few dollars of electricity, is just not worth it. And I think that's the direction we're headed on. And you know, we're going to be doing a pilot this spring and summer on sort of non-network charging stations, which I'm thinking is going to prove that point. But hopefully they answered that at least partially.
All right. Are there any other panelists that have an answer to that question?
I'm happy to take a swing at it as we think about some of the learnings that we've had on the private sector, who, as you can imagine, large fleet, different use cases, different geographic areas. In some ways, it's a similar question, depending on how they've built up their EVCI capacity. And I think it comes back to two different pieces of knowledge. One is from a site perspective or a charging infrastructure perspective, taking a total cost of ownership over a specified time frame for that particular site and getting clarity on sources of value and sources of cost is really important. So again, as you think about the site selection piece of it and what the adoption curve is for different use cases in your fleet, as well as what the charging utilization should look like in anticipated downtime based on industry standards achieved to date, there is some pretty there's some perspective around baking in, again, those maintenance and operating costs associated with it that can be included up front and thought through and refined as you know more from usage. That can also be partnered with how you think about your fleet decarb strategy. So knowing what you know around what you're going to electrify, the typical use cases for that type of vehicle, who owns them and how, can also inform, and kind of triangulating both the use cases and total cost of ownership, as well as how you think about total cost of ownership on an EVCI perspective, can get you at least some ballpark questions to refine and update as you get a more robust build out of your network, as well as you transition more and more of your fleet to net zero options.
Yeah, and I would just, picking up from what Shannon said, I think for fleet operators trying to, get their arms around the planning phases of this, somebody mentioned earlier concerns around having only one charger per two vehicles. I would just pick on that example for a minute to say that the use cases that Shannon was just mentioning, that telematics data, understanding what those fleet movements really are, how often that vehicle is typically on the road in the course of a day, where it's going to and from, all those vehicle movements, that data is so critical in determining what the likely battery impact is going to be, which then has, implications for the charging infrastructure that's needed. And so in some cases, we're seeing a 2-to-1 ratio that actually works because, there are maybe 10 vehicles, that are only doing short trips throughout the day, and then 10 other vehicles that are doing a long haul. And when they're charging is not all at the same time, or the ones that do come back late at night have already had a chance to top up at certain points throughout the day. So, it is kind of nuanced, when you think about understanding those use cases, but very important because it could make, the difference between millions of dollars in upgrade requirements at the site, from a utility standpoint. And also, going back to the points that have already been made on supply chain, you may not have to wait as long if you don't have to do major substation or transformer upgrades to get the infrastructure you need. So.
All right. Well, appreciate everyone's answer to that question. We've got about 5 minutes left if my clock is correct. So we'll move on to key takeaways. So just one key takeaway from today's conversation, and it has been a great one. And I'll turn it over to Commissioner Howalda to go first.
So I think the most important thing is to remember that each state is very different. State size, geography matters. What may work in a smaller state may not work in a larger one, and that's okay. You don't have to figure out everything right away, and you need to figure out what will work for your state based on what your state makeup is. And you really need to study the various components that may impact you and stay informed on emerging issues like lithium mining, battery storage, the future use of hydrogen. Now, Indiana has taken an all of the above approach with energy generation, and we may find that taking that same approach with our state vehicles may be the thing that we do until there's more EV infrastructure, auto manufacturers decide on a universal plug, workforce can be trained, and who knows, this may give time for the market to be able to dictate which vehicle trends will stick due to supply chain issues and energy generation needs. So regardless of what state you're in, it's super important to have this discussion and learn about what other states are doing, how has it worked, what challenges did they face, and start having that conversation with your own stakeholders to be able to determine what the next steps your state should embark on through this entire process.
All right, thank you, Commissioner. Josephine?
I'll go back to communication, making sure that you have an understanding of what your needs are, even if you're in the process of figuring it out, that you're trying to communicate with your own stakeholders within various agencies, with your stakeholders outside of that agency, and also with the private sector. Collaboration, which we've talked about a lot, but is incredibly important in this evolving space. And finally, contracting, understanding what your contracting options are. There's a lot of work that's being done right now to try to streamline the market and to make things easier for all of you. So I would leverage those resources as best you can, so you can really benefit from what others are doing to collaborate in the market.
All right, thank you. Director St. Jean?
Yes, thanks. I guess specifically, again, I'm speaking, about fleet vehicles is, if this is your area of responsibility, then think about what you really need. Don't confuse public charging with fleet. It's a whole different ballgame. And I contend it should be considerably simpler. Think about the value of, well, do we want to charge agencies for charging, one agency for charging and another agency's charging station? What are the costs of that? I mean, the cost of that could far outweigh any benefit of charging back a few dollars out of your budget. But I would just look at it in that light. Don't get too enthralled by the bells and whistles and the bright and shiny thing. Just look at what you actually need for your fleet and sort of let that be your guiding light.
Well said, I appreciate that. And Shannon?
Maybe two takeaways to cheat the question a little bit. One is go slow to go fast. And so I think it pays to be thoughtful around this, both in the EV and the procurement learnings that are going to be happening on the EVCI side of the house, as well as thinking about the use cases and fleet strategy questions that impact everyone's day-to-day lives. And the second thing that I would just say is get to know your utility friends, because there's so much of this that depends on having the right type of capacity and access to the right source of energy. That integrated capital programming and planning will be incredibly important in making this feel seamless.
Thank you, everyone on the panel, for your insights. This was a very valuable and timely conversation. For those of you that asked questions and didn't get them answered, please do follow our social media. I also hope that everyone will plan to join us for the next NASCA TV Presents. The topic will be green energy opportunities. So that's February 15th at 3 p.m. Eastern. Thanks, everyone.